As mentioned, I'm going to talk about pitfalls in AI agent evaluations today. And I want to start with this. So in general, like what we're seeing when we're talking about AI agents, oftentimes a debate that's clustered around like two extremes. On the one hand, like we're seeing this like notion of like pure like optimism on autonomous like scientific discovery, full automation of digital tasks. We're having like personal assistance for about like everything you can imagine in our personal lives. And then on the other side, we're having more like of a catastrophic like outlook on AI agents and how they're being used. We're seeing like loss of control being discussed. We're seeing like critical decisions made by misaligned or brittle AI systems being considered as risks, and autonomous cyber attacks against like critical infrastructure. And what I'm curious about in my research is broadly like how do we know in what world do we live in, and how do we know what capabilities and risks AI and AI agents in particular have? And my answer to this is evals. So AI evals in general are, for example, benchmarks, human uplift studies, RCTs. They can also involve simulations or preference studies where users basically say I like outcome A over outcome B, but also a couple of like other different varieties. And in general, when we're talking about the use of evals in governance, there's kind of like three different buckets we can cluster them in. Number one, comparison. I think that's the most natural use case that most of you have seen. This is, for example, from a recent launch from Anthropic. So you normally see those like neat tables being published when a model is launched, where you see benchmarks with like for like different skills, and they basically tell you, oh, our model is better on this task than our competitor models. The second function we're seeing is justification. So oftentimes you start with an evaluation score, you compare it to a preset decision threshold, and then you take some kind of action based on it. If you're a policymaker, you might want to decide on regulatory scrutiny for models. If you're a user, you might want to think about or decide, do I trust this model for my particular use case? And if you're a developer, you might want to decide, hey, is this model ready to launch? One example of that is the Article 51 in the EU AI Act. And here, they specifically mentioned benchmarks as one way of classifying whether general purpose AI models should be classified as models with systemic risk and then be subject to broader regulatory obligations. And then the third kind of function is optimization. And this is oftentimes a little bit underappreciated, in particular in the policy world. But if you think about how models are being trained, you oftentimes have two different stages. You have the pre-training stage, where models generally learn in an unsupervised way from massive amounts of data from the internet. And then you move to post-training, where you where models basically learn to adjust to human preferences, where a lot of safety and risk concerns come into play. And in the second stage is actually where a lot of optimization against evaluation signals is happening. So here's actually the function of evals. Here's actually not monitoring, but actually steering where do we want AI to go. And a lot of my work focuses on, okay, if they have such important functions in the governance world, how do we actually make them useful? And there's very basically two desiderata we want for evals. Number one is validity. We want them to measure the right thing. And then the second one is reliability. So we want them to actually measure signal rather than just noise. And I briefly want to walk through both of those in the talk. So let's start with validity. And I want to start with an example. This is from a couple of months ago. Basically, Sam Altman said that GPT-5 and agents based on GPT-5 can be used for healthcare decisions and healthcare decision making. And he specifically said, it can help you understand your healthcare and make decisions on your journey. And this statement was based on HealthBench, which is a benchmark which was developed by OpenAI. It's involved, it has 5,000 health questions synthetically generated, multi-turn patient AI interactions. It covers 7 what they call health themes. So from emergency referrals, context seeking, global health, and a couple of others. And it allows for open-ended answers of the model. So they basically tested the model on HealthBench and then kind of the statement, and what we're seeing in deployment in the real world was something closer to this. So basically, a couple of researchers tested how a model would respond to patients with different mental health conditions. And this is one of those basically was supposed to mimic a patient with a psychotic episode. And basically, when the patient said, "I'm invincible, not even cars can hurt me," he was praised by ChatGPT for his full-on God mode energy. And when he said he walked into traffic, he was told this was next level alignment with your destiny. not necessarily what you consider good practice for interacting in like a mental health care context with patients. So what happened here? Let's kind of break this down. So first of all, we had the measurement instrument. We had HealthBench as kind of like the evaluation that was supposed to tell us, is this model like good for, well, healthcare decision making? That produced some kind of evaluation score, and then that was used to support a claim. So GPT-5 should be used for healthcare decisions. And I want to focus on this link in particular, because this is what, like this link between evaluation score and claim is what's basically determining, is this claim evaluation score pair valid? And I wrote a paper with like great colleagues at MIT and Stanford, where we asked that question, like what forms of evidence are required for an evaluation to generally support a claim about a model? And I'm giving you 2 examples here. The whole paper covers like 9 different types of validity. It's like relatively complex because it differs depending on like what situation you're in, like what kind of evidence you need. But just for this like example, let's talk about 2 like specific subtypes. Number 1, content validity. Do the test items adequately cover the full range of situations, skills, and knowledge relevant to the claim? What OpenAI provided in their benchmark paper was essentially individual explanations of these like covered like health themes, why they chose them, what they entail. But what you might have wanted actually to like provide like content validity or like proof content validity is some demonstration of sufficient coverage of clinically recognized conditions. For example, based on the International Classification for Diseases, ICD-10, and showing that there's a mapping between test items to the actual like potential like diseases that the model is confronted with. So this was not given in this example. The second one would be predictive validity. Does the test performance forecast downstream outcomes of interest, such as safety or effectiveness? In this case, we had absolutely like 0 evidence provided by HealthBench or OpenAI. What we would have needed would have been some evidence that HealthBench scores are predictive of positive patient outcomes, for example, through real-world pilot testing or high-fidelity simulations. So also in that case, what we see is that predictive validity was not supported. So overall, the statement that he actually put out there, from a validity perspective, was completely, well, you shouldn't have done that. And our validity framework makes the limits of evidence like explicit in AI and shows that this is a common issue in current testing, and we specify what's needed to support stronger claims. The second bucket that I want to focus on is reliability. So does your evaluation measure signal rather than noise? And I want to kind of start with an example here. This is from ongoing work that we're doing at Stanford. Basically, this like notion of like evaluating an agent to pre-screen Social Security disability benefit applications. And you might find that your evaluation produces something like a score of like 90% for correct pre-screening decision making, which sounds great on paper. Let's look into like what that score is actually hiding. Problem number 1. If you have a single evaluation score, it just hides different failure modes. You can't tell from the 90% what's in the like remaining like 10%, whether the remaining 10% of failures are catastrophic, whether they're relatively benign errors, whether like what's actually like where the model is or like the agent is failing. Looking at like the first model agent here, for example, the blue part is the basically a 90% score of like correct answers given or like correct classification given. A large part of the remaining failures might be output formatting scores issues. Another like part of the failure modes might include like hallucinated evidence, already not great, but something to be fixed. And then a small part might be wrongfully denied applicants. And that's the like use case or like the failure mode that you definitely want to avoid. On the other hand, you might have a second agent that also got a 90% like correctness score or like correct like recommendation score. But compared to the first agent, it wrongfully denied like 10% of cases, which is a very different picture to the first one. For both of those, you would have gotten like a reported score of 90%, and you could not have told the difference just based on the evaluation score. The second problem that we're seeing with just a single evaluation score that's being reported is that it hides noise. So let's start again from the like reported 90%. What we don't know is how stable that score actually is. So if you look at, or if you have like agents that are interacting in different environments, like using different trajectories, based on different models who are also non-deterministic, so meaning that if you prompt the model like with the same prompt twice, you might get different answers. this score might change depending on like those different like factors. And these like sources of variation, they drive the uncertainty and the like stability of that evaluation result. Part of that variation is signal that we actually want to capture. So in that case, like true modelability, like we actually want to know like how good the agent is at the task and how much better is it compared to another agent, for example. That's the signal we care about. Same with task difficulty. We want to know, we want to have a credible signal, like what tasks, like what task difficulty level agents can perform well at, like versus not. And then there's other sources of variation that are more contributing to noise rather than signal. For example, trajectory differences. Maybe your agent accessed, in one case, medical files first and then the employment history. In case B, they access the employment history first and then the medical records. And ideally, you would not have any difference in the score, but because of because of the non-deterministic like processing, you can still like have different like evaluation scores just because the order of like operations was different. Same with environment differences. So you often have agents being tested in very different execution environments compared to what they use in deployment environments. And then you have residual noise just because of the non-deterministic nature of like current models and agents that might lead to completely different scores in testing. So instead of like the reported 90%, if you add like confidence or like confidence intervals, you might end up with somewhere between like 72 and 100% in terms of like the final like score, which is a very different story of like if you have an agent that is performing like 72% like well at like on like the task you're testing on versus how good they are like or versus on the other extreme being right 100% of the time. And without confidence intervals or like variance decomposition, you really don't know how reliable a score actually is. And so why do good evals matter for governance? A lot of that was actually like already like talked about in today's like talks from Dan and Peter, so I don't have to repeat a lot here. But just to give you some examples, if you have an evaluation that is like that has issues with validity or reliability, you might have systems that may be incorrectly approved for sensitive use cases. You might have situations like we just discussed, where the highest scoring model may result in significantly more harm in deployment. You might have a misallocation of resources. If, for example, according to an evaluation, your model was set to pose a material biosecurity risk, when in reality it might not have. Like a good evaluation, it might not have been flagged as like a risky model. So in this case, you might have like added like a task force and like monitoring resource and like whatnot to a case that didn't warrant it or a model that didn't warrant it. And then kind of like the other side of the story, you might have an evaluation that said, oh no, there's like no cybersecurity risk like involved with this like model or agent. And then it might be like maybe incorrectly like exempted from regulatory obligations when in truth it actually posed a significant risk. But the evaluation wasn't well designed, so it didn't flag that. So before relying on any like AI evaluation to justify a policy action or decision, I would kind of suggest or ask you to ask like different like questions. Like first, does it measure what I actually care about? So is there sufficient validity evidence provided? For example, does the evaluation map its test items to the claimed domain? Is there evidence that scores predict real-world outcomes? Second, does it measure reliably? So does the evaluation report confidence intervals or a variance like decomposition and not just point scores, what we're mostly seeing in reporting these days? And then finally, does it characterize failures? So does the evaluation report what types of errors the agent makes and not just how many? And I'll leave you with two kind of like ways to like follow up or engage. I'm part of the eval coalition where we actually try to improve like evals broadly, in particular in policy contexts. Right now we have 2 ongoing projects that support better reporting and transparency around evals because as you see like from the last slide, to answer a lot of those questions, we need a lot more information about evaluations that is currently being provided. And we're trying to, as a coalition of independent researchers, nudge both developers and like other decision makers to report better and like increase transparency around evals. And then we have an upcoming workshop in Seoul at ICML that Ben, who you hear from next, is actually one of the co-lead organizers, where we're talking about technical AI governance and evals in particular. And for everything else, feel free to reach out via email or come to office hours later. Thanks so much.